Right. Good afternoon or good morning if you are in Brazil. Welcome to our online conversation that we have chosen to call Brazil and the Global Crossroads, Latin America's Future in a Shifting Geopolitical Landscape. My name is Simon Davies, and I'm chair of the Financial Services Committee of the Brazilian Chamber of Commerce in the UK, based in London. The Brazilian Chamber of Commerce plays a key role in promoting bilateral trade and business relationships between Brazil and the United Kingdom. And I'm grateful to our chair, Vera Innes, who plays such a large part in this role of facilitating networking, providing information and resources to the wider Anglo-Brazilian business community. So welcome to everyone who's joining us on this presentation. I'm very delighted to be able to introduce you to two highly experienced and knowledgeable guest presenters. Fernando Honorato Barbosa, who I will call Honorato for the purposes of this conversation, is Chief Economist and Director of Economic Studies at Bradesco, one of Brazil's largest banks. He's been with Bradesco for 21 years and is based in Sao Paulo. He's a specialist in the Brazilian foreign sector and macroeconomic policies since the Plano Real back in the 1990s, and he's a regular participant in various events held by the Central Bank of Brazil, the IMF, and the World Economic Forum. So welcome, Honorato. Our other guest is Luis Fernando Lopes. He is partner, chief economist, and strategist at Patria Investments. Patria is a renowned alternative investment firm with Brazilian roots and with a huge global presence. And Luis Fernando is currently based in London. So we have this nice balance in terms of Sao Paulo and London. He's been with Patria for almost 28 years. He has a master's degree from the University of Sao Paulo. So welcome and I'm very, very grateful to both Honorato and Luis Fernando for joining us on this presentation. If I could just talk a little bit about housekeeping and the format. We welcome questions. I'm obviously we're trying to keep this whole presentation very conversational. Obviously, I will be asking questions, and at the same time, we would like you to send in your questions. So please post your questions in the chat, and I can moderate them, and hopefully we will get the opportunity to present those questions. The conversation is going to last for about an hour, and without further ado, I'm going to kick off now and ask my first question, which is really we're going to talk about Brazil, we're going to talk about the domestic economy, and then we're going to talk about the world in which we live in. Obviously the sort of fairly belligerent industrial policy from the United States currently, and how that might affect Brazil. But let's start off, and if I could perhaps, Luis Fernando, if I could address the first question, please give us a little bit of an introduction to the size of the Brazilian economy, the size and the variation of the Brazilian economy, so that not everybody knows about Brazil. So a good opportunity for you to perhaps kick off this conversation and tell us a little bit about the Brazilian economy.
Sorry, I was down for a minute, but I'm back.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, we noticed that. I thought it was just a temporary glitch.
Thank you.
Okay, Simon, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the Chamber for the invitation. Always a pleasure and a privilege. So it's important first to characterize this Brazilian economy, because we are going to talk about how the Brazil is likely to perform in this shifting global environment. So Brazil is the largest economy in Latin America. Actually, it's substantially larger than Mexico, which comes second. We are talking about over $2 trillion of GDP. But that's most importantly, is that unusual combination of a very, very large consumer market. We are talking about household consumption, for example, accounts for nearly 2/3 of Brazil's GDP. Lots of services, lots of manufacturing activity, diversified. But in addition to that, Brazil has this unusual expertise on commodities. Broadly speaking, it's grains, it's about animal proteins, pork, beef, poultry. It's about minerals, and now even oil and gas. So this diversified and actually highly dynamic economy is facing a more challenging global environment. As we have seen actually over the past 10 years or so, we are facing a crisis that is not produced in emerging markets, and definitely it's not a crisis coming from Brazil. So we had the global financial crisis back in 2008 and 9, then we have COVID, which was a global crisis. Now we have this, I could say, trade crisis triggered by, Simon had a very good term for it, belligerent trade policy of the United States. So I thought what we'll be discussing right now, I'm going to finish my introduction here as well. What the most likely outcome of this trade crisis that we are having, and then with more detail, how Brazil is likely to perform into this new environment. But let me finish my introduction here.
Cool. So, by way of that introduction as well, Honorato, perhaps you could just tell us a bit about the way that Brazilian GDP has been developing over the past several years.
I'm going to steal part of the thunder of my colleague Honorato, but Brazil has been performing better than expected. Actually, if you look at since the COVID, Brazil recovered much faster than was the market consensus in terms of the drawdown in economic activity. It was much smaller than everybody expected in 2020. And then the recovery was much faster and stronger in 2021. And then 2022, 2023, 2024, the economic growth has been persistently above market expectation. You cannot explain that, in our view. First, you have to take in consideration that this is a much more diversified and dynamic economy that people was supposed that Brazil would be. But probably, very likely, there is the effect of a number of structural reforms that have been enacted and implemented over the past 6, 7, 8 years, which probably caused Brazil's long-term growth potential to be higher than people expect. And so the economy reacts better to shocks. And, for example, you cannot understand how an economy is still posting something close to 3% growth with short-term interest rates that are north of 14%. In any other country in the world, you put interest rates, short-term interest rates at the level, that would be economic depression. And Brazil is still growing quite a lot. So it's a combination of the structural characteristics of the economy plus, in our view, the positive impact or the favorable impact of structural reform that have been approved or enacted over the past few years.
Okay, well that's a couple of things. I mean, there's two things that come out of that. Firstly, you did touch on interest rates, and my question, I'm going to ask two questions in one. Firstly, interest rates are high in Brazil. What's your view on the future? Are they going to come down? Are they going to go up? What's going to go on? But secondly, are there any sectors that are performing particularly well in the Brazilian economy, which are helping this GDP performance? Honorato, perhaps you could contribute.
Yes, no, it's my pleasure, Simon. My pleasure being with you and with Luis, very nice friend. So, and again, sorry for my 1 minute. I don't know, Windows just decided to push me down. Anyway, so very quick compliment on what Luis just said. Well, if you pick the last 45 years of Brazilian history, and I'm going for a long span here, the average GDP growth in Brazil was about 2.2%. Okay, so that's the story of Brazil. So if you ask a Brazilian economist what is potential GDP, he'll probably answer 2.2% because we are not that much creative, so it's just 2.2%. While the global economy has grown 3.5 during these 45 years. So Brazil is lagging behind the global growth for a long time. Having said that, and I fully agree with what Luis just said, if you separate this 45-year history in two big, I would say, sets. One is moments when Brazil creates local disturbances, when we create local problems. Then Brazilian GDP growth or growth minus 1.7% on average. and this comprises about 1/4 of the period. Okay, so 1/4 of the period Brazil is creating its own crisis, and this is a big issue for local GDP that drops 1.7%, while the global economy in these same moments is growing about 2.7, 2.8%. Well, if you pick the other 3/4 of time, when Brazil is not creating crisis, when we are doing reforms, when we are being more, I would say, well, when the rules are being attached and so on, Brazil grows 3.3% on average. So it's the 2.2 average for the last 45 years shows a big divergence between years of crisis and non-crisis years. So attaching myself here to the non-crisis years, that goes exactly to what Luis was mentioning, the reform periods. This is my initial remarks on growth. And second, just for the very short term, since the pandemic, I totally agree that potential GDP is higher than my colleagues expect or estimate here in Brazil. But I also attach part of the surprise on growth to the huge government expenditure that has come since the pandemic. And this will link to some of the stories on interest rates and that dynamics. Okay, just to put these two topics here, Davis, Simon, so we can keep the conversation flowing in a few minutes. Well, going to our point on interest rates, I definitely believe rates will go down medium term. There's no way Brazil will keep interest rates at 10% in real terms for the long term. It's absolutely not sustainable. But remember, I just mentioned part of the reason why interest rates are high is because the government spent too much money the last 2.5 years, and this helped to boost inflation. And inflation is double the level of the center of the target. The center of the target is 3% right now. Inflation is running at 5.8, 5.7, so almost double the center of the target. So the central bank is fighting this inflation. That, truth to be told, is not high for Brazilian standards. If you pick inflation at 5.7, the finance minister had a chance to say that a couple of weeks ago, and he said, well, inflation between 4.5 to 5.5% in Brazil is kind of common. Yeah, I totally agree to that extent. It's a matter of fact of Brazilian history since the 90s. But the thing is, we decided as a society 3 years ago to have a lower inflation target to 3% that aligns Brazil with other emerging markets. We can discuss a lot, and I'll finish in a second. We can discuss a lot whether a 3% target is appropriate or not for Brazil. Personally, I think it's not that appropriate because of fiscal reasons, because of how much Brazil is a closed economy, what's helping these days, but does not help for having low inflation. So anyway, but we have 3% inflation target. And as a result, the central bank is fighting that. So I believe that with the help of the global environment, I assume what Trump is doing will be mildly disinflationary for the rest of the world, apart from the US. Second, there's so much tightening in Brazil that the Brazilian economy will decelerate, will eventually decelerate. I agree with being surprised on the upside, but will eventually decelerate. And as a result, I assume we will end the next year with rates close to 11 something, instead of the current 14, 15 we are just discussing now, Simon.
Okay. And you touched on the structural reforms. I mean, do you see there's scope for further structural reforms as part of this, this ongoing effort in order to normalize some aspects of the Brazilian economy?
Let me just put some color here on the reforms that Luis just mentioned. Well, so we had very important ones, mainly a pension reform. We had a reform on the credit market. It was very important. A set of reforms on the credit market that helped reduce, I would say, the government interference in the credit arena. So if you look at capital markets in Brazil, mostly on debt capital markets, a little bit less on equities, but the debt capital markets is absolutely booming in Brazil because of these reforms. We have much better collateral these days. We had reforms on water and sewage. We had reforms aiming at simplifying over the rules of the economy. So these were really interesting ones that helped a lot. So if you ask me, what is the big structural reform that Brazil still needs moving forward, I would say, is a reform of the budget, mainly aiming to help stabilize that to GDP. And here things start to become a little bit complicated. I hope you guys have time. No, I promise to be very short here. But the idea is there's not a simple answer to you, Simon, in the sense, what is the big reform that would solve Brazilian problems moving forward? I would say there's not a candlestick that you look and say, well, this is the one reform, but we probably need to push a little bit further on the pension. We probably need to push a little bit further on the indexation of the budget. It might not sound familiar for those not familiar with Brazil, might sound strange, but the budget in Brazil is really rigid. So there's nothing much the government can do to maneuver the budget and help, for example, create some surplus, primary surplus, to help reduce the level of indebtedness. So we need to attack these rigidities. We need to attack this the indexation of the budget. There are lots of minor details. I don't want to bother you with all that. But I would say that the challenge of the next president probably relates to becoming or to having a fiscal rule that is credible medium term, that is able to sustain for, let's say, 5 to 10 years, in a way that we investors and the society look at the debt to GDP and say, well, this will eventually stabilize, and as a result of that, we'll see much lower interest rates. If those things happen, then obviously there are lots of micro reforms that could help the economy. But by the end of the day, if we have low interest rates, I would say investments would flow back in Brazil, families would be able to consume, credit will flow again, so will flow faster again. So my general sense, and then I don't know if Luis agrees or not, but we implemented very important reforms. Now we need to make sure that the budget is sustainable medium term. This is still not working properly in Brazil.
Luis, would you like to comment on that? And perhaps I could also ask, one of the things about investment in Brazil from the point of view of external investors is the volatility of the currency. Perhaps you could also supplement your answer with some of your ideas on the expectations for the Brazilian real going forwards.
Okay, what I would add to Honorato's view. So being probably the elderly here in this conversation, I started in the financial markets in 1990. And then I remember, if you have to list what were the Brazilian main macroeconomic challenges, all of them, from A to Z. So we had 6,000% inflation. Now we have the problem is that we're having 6% annual inflation. Back then it was 1,000 times more. It was 6,000%. And an external crisis, and because we didn't have international reserves and we were in external debt moratorium, and the fiscal was a disaster, etc. So over time, perhaps took much more time than necessary. We were addressing this thing. So no, inflation is not a major threat for Brazilian economy. So the target is 3, we are now close to 6. That's not good, but it's completely addressable, so to speak. We don't have an external restriction anymore. So for me, for example, Brazil had probably the worst first quarter 2025 in terms of capital outflow that we had in decades. The currency appreciated. So if we lost the amount of dollars we lost in the first quarter of this year, 25, 30 years ago, we would be with capital controls, etc. So
we would be dead. I fully agree. We would be dead, yeah.
Exactly. So what's going on here on the fiscal? What we have, and then I'm going to land in the currency volatility as well. We have a budget that was created and perfected, quote unquote, not perfected, during hyperinflation. So you need to index everything. Otherwise, 1 month of expenditure that you did not make on education, on health, it was a complete disaster and people will be dying, etc. So we still live with a budgetary framework that is coming from hyperinflation. We have to index everything, etc. So we are no longer in hyperinflation. And the budget should be indexed, and the rigidities. I have to link this expenditure to the minimum wage increase. Why? There is no reason for that. Other things are related to the net tax proceeds. So this fiscal reform that Honorato mentioned is a step forward in ending our linkage to the hyperinflation era. But the moment you decide that you are not indexing the budget, then you have to decide on priorities, right? How much I'm going to spend on education, how much I'm going to spend on healthcare, how much I'm going to spend on defense, how much I'm spending on agriculture or land reform. And that's become a more complicated proposition because in Brazil, we are not that used to have this conversation about priorities. So that's part of the process is fiscal, purely speaking. The other part of the process is discussing priorities. And then the locus to do this, and that's what Brazil is not used, is not what the federal government wants to do. Actually, the locus, the place to do this is the Congress. Actually, in any country in the world, the budget is the very reason of the existence of the Congress. So we have to enable deputies and senators to discuss that. But I'm not quite sure if Brazilians look at their Congress and the representatives and the senators, and they are convinced that they are able to discuss priorities. So that's another discussion. We moved into political theory here. But another part of the Brazilian institutional framework that is still coming from the hyperinflation is the FX market. Brazil is one of the few countries that I know of in which every FX transaction has to be recorded at the central bank. It's not controlled by the central bank, but you have to record everything at the central bank as if you were having $6 billion of international reserves, and then the central bank was decided, oh, I can authorize this, I cannot authorize that. The kind of we in terms of the to-do list to have a freer, more flexible FX market, perhaps aiming at having a Brazilian currency being fully convertible, we are ages away. So what happens here? We have this big economy with a relatively big tradable sector relying on a very, very narrow, unregulated FX market. So what happens here? Bonanza times, and everything is going fine in terms of trade are good, no external crisis. This inflow of capital that goes to Brazil through portfolio, FDI, trade balance, produce an excess appreciation of the currency. Let us remember, for example, this is not a far, a distant past, you could buy a dollar paying 160 real. So the currency was massively overvalued. And then when things don't go that well, the capital outflow creates an unnecessary depreciation of the currency. So we are always overshooting and undershooting the currency. The best way to address this, it's relatively simpler compared to the fiscal reform, which is basically we have to deregulate the FX market more than we did. We are moving in the right direction, but it is still an overly regulated FX market. Having said that, what do we believe is going to happen with the currency? We use Patria does long-term investments, so we don't do trading, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the short term. But for our investments, we try to measure the currency in terms of purchasing power parity, which is a long-term metric to see whether the currency is trading in line with fundamental, or it's overvalued or undervalued. At 580 whatever real to the dollar, the currency, the Brazilian currency, is still undervalued. Now, our calculation is probably 15% undervalued because if you look at the trade balance, look at all this stuff, there is no need to have the dollar that high. Better, it's getting better. So it was 630, not far away. Now it's appreciated a little bit, but the Brazilian currency is still cheap looking to fundamentals. Having said that, do we think that the real is going to appreciate a lot? Difficult to see this happen in the short term, say the next 6 to 1 year, because we have this trade crisis. So now we have the world's biggest economy creating a trade crisis, a confrontation with China, threatening to leverage tariffs completely out of the blue on a discretionary way. So probably the currency will try sideways, it's still on the undervaluation territory. But then probably over the next 6 to 12 months, you're going to see other currencies a little bit stronger than the Brazilian real, already pricing in that we are going to have slower growth in the US, more than in the rest of the world. The US is not going to win this trade war, probably other geographies, Asia, China, Europe, Latin America, Brazil, they are going to build up their own trade alliances and foreign investment alliance, and these other currencies are likely to appreciate. We are already seeing this, for example, the euro. We live here in London. The British pound and the euro are already appreciating significantly against the US dollar. So it's not yet for the real to go in that direction, but definitely for the depreciation of the real, it's difficult to see. Probably 2-3 years from now, assuming that the trade crisis is going to be over and Brazil will go through the electoral cycle, that's something probably we're going to discuss today, probably there is room for more significant appreciation because we think that the real is still undervalued.
Okay, well, thank you for those insights. I found myself learning an awful lot about the Brazilian economy in those few words you provided. But talking about the trade crisis, as you call it, and the belligerent industrial policy that I called it, to what extent does Brazil's economy depend on exports to foreign markets? And I mean, compared to other countries, and therefore its vulnerability. Could you give us some insights into the potential vulnerability that it has in terms of the economy and exports?
Okay, I'm going to start this, answer your question, and then I'll hand over to Honorato. So Brazil is still, as Honorato rightly put it, it's a relatively closed economy. In terms of the total exports, or if you have some export plus import to GDP, we are in the 25-ish%. So it's not that much. It's relatively small. It's much smaller, for example, than Mexico. But then, starting on the good stuff, Brazil is not heavily dependent on any geography. So just put it into perspective. Brazilian exports 12% of its total merchandise exports to the US. Mexico exports 77%. So for Mexico, what the US market is a matter of life and death. And that's why Mexico is going to concede everything in the United States wants, not only on trade, on immigration, on the supposed production of fentanyl, etc., because they cannot live without the United States. Well, if you look at Brazil, Brazil is relatively diversified. Our major trade partner is not the US, it's actually China. Then US compares relatively, not very different from the share that Europe has in terms of trade. If you go to Brazil, also has some interesting diversification in the Middle East, etc. So basically, the foreign trade is not Brazil's major driver of growth. We may discuss looking at, for example, the Brazilian stock market, or if you take Brazilian bonds traded offshore, the vast majority of them are related somewhat to export because they are dollar-generating assets, etc. But the economy is a different composition. The economy is basically a domestic consumption story. And just to give an intuition here, Simon, Brazil is so relying on consumption, not on trade, that actually government consumption as a share of GDP is higher than the total capital formation in Brazil. So if you take gross fixed capital formation in Brazil as a share of GDP, it's smaller than the government spending. So this is the economy that depends a lot on consumption, the household consumption, private consumption, and always also government consumption. So the trade story adds to the domestic growth story. So if the rest of the world is in a good environment, the environment is benign, then this speeds up the growth that is driven by local fundamentals. When the external scenario becomes hostile or less than friendly, then this external scenario, the trade, etc., is slow down the growth that comes from domestic fundamentals. Right now, we are moving a situation that basically the external sector is going to be a drag on growth. But going back again to the point we were discussing before, probably Brazil is going to grow close to 2%. That's the focus, the central bank's weekly market survey. So we're probably going to grow something around 2%, adjusted for inflation. So it's slowed down from over 3% last year. But the bulk of it doesn't come from trade. Actually, the bulk of it comes from we have very high interest rates and then some credit tightening, credit conditions are tightened. That's going to be the bulk of the slowdown. And then the trade thing is going to probably add a little bit more to the slowdown. But it's definitely not the case in Mexico. Mexico, for example, is going to have a recession this year. Discussions whether its growth is going to be zero or negative. And it's 150% driven by trade because the US is slowing down. In addition to that, it is imposing severe tariffs on Mexico. That's a completely different proposition. So Brazil is this other country. But then Let me hand over to Honorato to hear his views.
Yeah, no, let me just try to complement a couple of things here. First of all, it's a type of short-term blessing being a closed economy these days, as Luis was pointing. I regret a lot Brazil not to be much more open because we lack competitiveness, we lack growth of productivity, and we also lack a stabilization for inflation, as I was saying before. So don't get me wrong. I think Brazil is missing. Part of the reason why we grow less than the global economy is exactly because we are a closed economy. But right now, it's a type of blessing. It will help, as Liz was pointing. So U.S. Exports is 12% of total exports, while exports as a share of GDP is 15%. So it's less than, let's say, 1.7 percentage point of GDP is directly linked to the U.S. So this is not a channel that should concern Brazil. This is the first thing. The second is we might see some trade diversion. These expressions becoming common within economists these days. So just to put some context here, China buys around $29 billion in food from US, mostly protein and grains. Brazil exports $42 billion to China in proteins and grains. And there are only two countries in the world that could replace the US crop production into the next 12, 18 months. And these countries are Argentina and Brazil, mostly Brazil, more than Argentina. So Brazil could benefit partially from this diversion of trade if China decides to buy part of this $29 billion in food from US and starts buying from Brazil. And that also links to a question you asked before, Simon, and I forgot to answer about which sectors are doing great. And agriculture is doing really, really great in Brazil and will still be doing great for the next few years or so. Not only, but just to put the agricultural story here. So anyway, so it might be a blessing, a short-term blessing. We might benefit from some short-term diversion of trade. So to that extent, Brazil is not a candidate to suffer like Mexico, as Luis was pointing out, even all the other Latin American countries that are facing further risks. Having said that, two first final things here on this topic. So first, I really believe it's very hard to see a stronger dollar, as Luis was pointing, globally, just because what we've been seeing in the US is a huge protectionist measures. This means lower growth, and it's very hard to see the dollar becoming stronger. So to that extent, and together with the fact that Brazil is not the main focus of this current environment, maybe I'll be a little bit more optimistic than Luis on the perspectives of the real. Again, this is not my baseline. My baseline is still for a stable currency, as Luis was mentioning. But if I look at fundamentals, Luis mentioned maybe 15% appreciation on the appreciation of the currency. But if you look for the last 45 years, again, since the 80s, the BRL should be traded at 4 reais per dollar, not 6 reais per dollar. So there's a huge room for an appreciation of the currency if, for whatever reason, we don't have a global chaos. But then comes to the second part of the story. Even myself, that I'm a little bit more optimistic with Brazil not facing these huge side effects of what's going on in the US, I acknowledge that it's not good for anyone what's going on globally. So it's very hard to see the hate and the uncertainty. It's very hard to see the worsening of financial conditions not affecting Brazil. So to that extent, I think, unfortunately, even with Brazil not being the main focus of Trump, or even we being a little bit protected for maybe not that good reasons because we are too closed, the financial links probably makes Brazil as, I would say, common as other emerging markets these days. And again, Luis, at the very beginning of his remarks, he said, not only Brazil is a large economy, but we have the deepest financial market of the entire emerging world. So there's no other country in the world where you can trade the volumes you trade in Brazil. Maybe China, but China, the capital controls, they don't allow you to be that that in and out so frequently. So anyway, so I still believe Brazil is the largest one. So that you can trade these huge volumes, that you can trade local bonds, that you can trade hard currency bonds, that you can trade corporate bonds, and protect and hedge against any type of external vulnerability. So to that extent, the financial links might hurt Brazil this time, and so I agree that the BRL might not perform much better than where we see. But you see, I'm being cautious here because to the other part of the story is we also offer the largest carry trade in the world. What does carry trade mean? So we have the highest interest rate differentials between Brazil and the other emerging markets, and also the US and Europe. So trying to make it simple here. If Brazil, for the next 12 months, if Trump, to some extent, recedes in a couple of things, the global economy does not go into a big recession. I think we'll see some recession, but not a big one. Maybe we will see Brazil getting out of this crisis on a better position than we are today.
Okay, cool. That if I can just take you back a little bit, Luis Fernando, you were commenting on the closed economy that Brazil has. I'm going to move into our Latin American neighbors. Do you see a role for Mercosur? Do you think that Mercosur can work as it is currently structured? Do you see some adaptation? What do you see the future of Mercosur? And also, if we could take it a little bit further, is there a role for the BRICS in all of this opening up of the Brazilian economy, or potential opening up of the Brazilian economy?
Okay, so our take here on Mercosur. So Mercosur compared to BRICS is an entity that has a function. We can say that it's not functioning, working that well, but at least the countries get together, they have common tariffs, some discussions, whether some divergence, etc. But it's something that has a function, and probably it's going to be more active. I think we mentioned here already. There is this, if not, I'm going to mention right now, there is this free trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur, and that was lagging behind or was pending for 25 years. And then immediately after Trump was elected, guess what? Now we have the things moving on. So definitely Mercosur is going to be more active than it was before. But having said that, we still have a problem within Mercosur, because right now we have one country, which is the second largest, most important, which is Argentina, and that would clearly to move Mercosur into much more ambitious trade agenda, free trade agreements, not only with the European Union, with anybody else, could be China, could be Asia, could be, whereas Brazil, for example, is far more conservative on this, at least in this administration. So we are a little bit on the optimistic side about Mercosur, but we cannot be overly optimistic. As for BRICS is a very funny acronym, but in the end of the day, it means very little these days. So putting everybody on the same page, BRICS is the amalgamation of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa in the first edition, and then we had already 5 new members. Now we have Iran, Egypt, United Arab Emirates. In terms of common policies, common strategies, etc., zero. Basically, now these days has been more a locus or a venue for Putin, President Putin of Russia, trying to show that he's not isolated. Look, we are inviting new members to BRICS, and when there is a meeting of the BRICS in Kazakhstan, he can go there without being put into jail. So it doesn't mean many things these days. So in terms of the BRIC thing, we expect noise, but without significant result. We look, for example, the Brazilian point of view. Brazil was initially against the inclusion of additional members in the BRICS. Now he had to concede. And now, because of Putin again, he invited a lot, I think 12 or 14 other countries to join. And I think Brazil probably is going to veto that. So in terms of BRIC thing, unlike Mercosur, I don't think we are going far, and we shouldn't spend much time on trying to tell what BRICS is going to do as an institution.
Do you have anything to add, Honorato, onto that very negative
I was just
view?
laughing here because I have absolutely the same view. And sorry to be so bold on that, Simon, but what does BRICS mean? So we don't have a common language. We don't have common. We are not neighbors. We don't have a common currency. We just well, obviously, my colleague at Goldman Sachs he created this interesting acronym, so it's very good to think theoretically about that. But doesn't mean a thing. It's only creating to some extent problems to countries like Brazil that we are a democracy and we are close to autocracies in this group, and it creates some confrontations with the US. So it makes no sense at all. And again, I think it's obvious, as Luis was saying, trying is a sort of influence zone of Xi Jinping and Putin. So it's more like that. Anyway, but I don't think it has practical economic things. You might have heard you guys listening us. You might have heard of maybe BRICS currency replacing the dollar. Forget that. It will simply not happen. So it doesn't. It's not something for us to take that seriously as an economic institution. Well, going to the Mercosur and very shortly on Mercosur, just to add, was quite interesting because Milei and Lula, they have very different political platforms. Yes, Milei is a much more of a center-right, or maybe a right arm candidate. Lula is much more of a center-left or left candidate. And they were very far apart on that idea. And Milei was claiming to get independent from Mercosur, trying to become more aligned with the US, maybe a free trade agreement with the US, and so on. But what happened last week, with Trump just pushing tariffs to 10% overall, and Milei was included in that, was maybe frustrating for him anyway, but was 10% too. I think I agree with Luis to the extent that maybe Mercosur will find its way, not a way out, is maybe too much of a strong sense, but you find again some ties and say, well, we have Europe to help us. Or we can tie with US stronger than with China, for example. So to some extent, I think Mercosur will be revitalized to some extent after what happened with the Trump tariffs. And again, that goes back to Milei's position because Milei is doing a great job in Argentina, and I really think he's doing some very interesting economic improvements there. But they were so much apart on political views that maybe Trump will make them converge to some common ground and trying to put Mercosur in front of Europe and say, and Europe now needs Mercosur because one of the reasons why, and I know Luis is sitting in London, not in Brussels anyway, but Europeans they were against the Mercosur agreement partially because of agriculture. Now they might be thinking, well, maybe we need a reliable partner because the US is not as reliable as we were believing. So Mercosur might benefit from that. Let me tell you a very quick story here. That was said in a big forum, so I'm not saying anything that's confidential. But European leaders, they were concerned about their payment systems because they rely a lot on Visa, they rely a lot on American Express, they rely a lot on MasterCard. What if, for whatever reason, the US government says, okay, you see these payment systems, I will tariff them. I will put some barriers to that. So, and Latin America and Brazil has lots of these payment systems well developed. So I think we will see the connections between Latin America and Europe strengthening from now on and not getting weaker.
Paul, that's I'm conscious of time and the fact that we're moving on, and it is a fascinating subject, and I've got a list of questions that will go on and on, but I'm going to go to our audience. Alinta asked a question, and it's very relevant to this conversation. Why is there so little business between UK and Mercosur? And why is the pound going so high? And I know you've touched on it, but perhaps you could just refer to this in terms of the context that we're talking about, whereby US industrial policy could inadvertently be pushing different partnerships together.
Let me start answering this. The UK has a trade problem, actually not only with Latin America, with almost the rest of the world. So the question here in London is why the UK doesn't trade much more with several other geographies. So difficult to explain why. The short term, what has been happening since 2016 is very understandable. So what happened in 2016 perhaps similar to what we are seeing now in the United States, was a domestic decision, an economic policy. In that case, was basically a referendum that produced a Brexit that nobody understands exactly what happened. I think the UK government, or the UK as a country, pretty much lost its route. It doesn't know exactly what to do. So whether should we get closer to Europe again? No, try to do something different to the US. What's the stance towards Asia? So to some extent, it's up to the UK to decide what they want to do. In terms of trade, the relationship between Latin America and Brazil and the UK goes back more than 200 years. Actually, basically, UK financed, in the case of Brazil, our paying the Portuguese to get the hell out of Brazil. So we bought our independence basically with capital coming from the British capital market. So, and in addition to that, it was the most important provider of industrial goods for Brazil for ages until the United States stepped forward. So, in terms of having a precedent, it's there. It's most on the side of the UK decide what they want to do, not only with Latin America and Brazil, but actually the rest of the world. Why the pound is appreciating? Definitely not because the economy here in the UK is outperforming, or that the UK is having a tremendous trade surplus. It's basically on two things. If you look at the tariff things, and Europe, there is a lot of back and forth. Now there is this 9-day moratorium. Nobody knows what's going to happen because the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs were suspended by President Trump unilaterally. But then if you look at the original design, UK was not charged at 20%, which was the typical reciprocal tariff for Europe. UK is much less, it's almost half. So there is this perception that UK is going to pay lower tariffs compared to the European Union. That's factor number one. But factor number two, clearly, and you have seen already the flows, monies from Middle East, from Asia, they are not that comfortable in going to the United States anymore. So the point that Honorato very correctly stressed about uncertainty, it has a cost. The capital flows are being, we are talking about trade diversion, we are talking also about portfolio and capital flows diversion. Some monies are not, some investors are not comfortable to go into the US because you can have this unilateral tariff on payments, but you can have some kind of capital control as well if the United States decided that that country is not behaving properly, and then they said, okay, you know what, we are going to freeze your assets. So there is a lot of capital flow into the UK because it's perceived as a more reliable, and the track record of London being the financial hub of the world goes back 200, 300 years. So part of this story is not on tariffs, it's based on London being perceived as a very interesting alternative to US financial market.
Cool. Okay.
Sorry, I was not able to unmute. Very quick, Simon.
Yes.
Type of a joke. I don't resist that. But there's maybe one advantage of living in an emerging market like myself and Luis, knowing emerging markets for a long time. We know the negative consequences of uncertainty. We know very well. And it was crystal clear to me and to my colleagues in emerging markets doing our research. It's almost impossible to think how the Trump agenda could help even the US economy. So we learned at very hard costs the way of uncertainty on economic growth. And unfortunately, we are just seeing that happening. The second is about inflation. I remember back during the pandemic when we saw inflation skyrocket, and my colleagues in the West were saying, well, how do you guys forecast inflation? How do that? How can you see this is going on? We had a huge fiscal stimulus, so on. So we were able to forecast inflation. Just to make my point and type of joke to say, we in the emerging markets, we know exactly what's going on in the global economy these days.
Well, thank you very much for that. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to move on a little bit to talk, again, conscious of the time. And I'm sure many people have got questions and want to hear a little bit about your view of the future in Brazil. Can I, perhaps let's talk about Brazil's unique position as an energy producer and a green superpower. Do you think that Brazil's got a hand that they can play globally in this particular sphere, especially when we see a lot of emphasis on the cost of energy and how it has risen considerably, and also the future energy requirements of the world in relation to the use of data centers, artificial intelligence, etc. Do you have some views on Brazil and where the Brazilian position may take us in the future?
Maybe I can start here. So we at the bank, and that's not to talk about Bradesco, but we are one of the largest private sector financiers of green energy projects, mainly solar power plants and wind power generation. So we not only believe a lot in that, but we are putting a lot of money on these stars. But having said that, a couple of things. When you think about electrification in Brazil, it's not simple to believe or to assume that Brazil will have electric vehicles as we see lots of them running in Europe, because we also have ethanol. And ethanol is very competitive in environmental terms. So if you pick door to door, the consumption of CO2 of a car that's fueled by ethanol, it's a little bit less than a car door to door, even in Brazil with very high clean energy, powered by electricity. So I don't think Brazil will become a country of huge electrification for let's say for automobility. This is part of the story. About data centers, we've seen a huge demand from investors searching for land, searching for places where obviously there's plenty of energy for them to build their data centers. I think Brazil can establish itself as a country with these asset for the global economy. We don't have the cheapest energy in the world, that's true, but the cost of producing these new solar power plants is dropping dramatically, and it's becoming more competitive. One step back, the supply of energy in the Brazilian grid is growing quite fast because of these individual, what we call small individuals just providing energy to the grid with these solar power plants. So the supply of energy is becoming large. So energy cost is not a big issue. And then when we convert into dollar terms, I see an interesting demand from investors to look at Brazil as a hub of this clean energy. I don't know exactly. Well, I'm a part of the World Economic Forum. I'm a member of the World Economic Forum discussions about clean energy and so on. So we see some setbacks on this environment issue with Trump for sure. But if I look forward, how do you export energy? It's not simple for Brazil exporting energy. So we can have the data center, that's good, but how can you export energy? So if the demand for clean products in Europe rises, then Brazil is a country that could benefit a lot, because our products, our soybean, our cattle is based on an agriculture that typically benefits from clean energy. So I think Brazil is definitely a hub of clean energy globally, including green hydrogen. But I don't know if the timing is right now. Just more like that. It's growing quite fast, but I think the global timing has changed a bit.
Well, Luis Fernando, can you also, I mean, I'm going to open it up a bit as well, because I mean, there is this whole issue of lower global carbon emissions that is, as you rightly say, Honorato. I mean, the US may have pushed things back a little bit with some of their activities, but Brazil has another advantage, and that's in terms of its ability to supply critical minerals, rare earth materials as well. Is that another potential opportunity, do you think, that Brazil has?
Definitely. The problem that Brazil doesn't have is lack of opportunities. Our problem is how we explore these opportunities. That's another discussion. But adding some numbers just to what Honorato said, and then I'm going to go into the critical minerals, etc. So Brazil, if you take electricity generation in Brazil, we are talking about 90% is renewable. If you add total power usage, which includes electricity plus transportation, for example, Brazil's is the matrix is 2/3 renewables. No other country in the world has anything even close to that. So we are already a leader in green energy, and we have substantial investment from Chinese investors here through Patria in Brazil. And then, for example, we discussed with the largest producer of electrical vehicles, and then they showed the calculation. So reinforcing the message that Honorato already delivered. If you pick the best in class electric vehicle produced in China, and then you trace the CO2 emissions, a Brazilian biofuel car emits less. Why? Because not only the fuel is the ethanol is not very aggressive in terms of CO2, but the car, the tires that you assemble the car, the seats, the engine, everything is produced with inputs that has this green energy in the matrix. So if you trace all the CO2, you are already the cleanest producer of nearly everything in the world. So having said that, in addition to that, Brazil has large proven reserves of critical minerals. We are talking about copper, we are talking about lithium, we are talking about manganese, etc. Part of these deposits are already being explored, but we are probably exploring 15%, 20% of the potential. Chile, for example, in Latin America is far more advanced than we are, and even Bolivia is moving faster than we are. So having said that, if you take not only Brazil, but Latin America as a whole, or countries that are Mercosur plus, for example, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, etc., it would be probably the second critical supplier of critical minerals in the world after China. So what's happening here as we speak? US has already realized that. So in the middle of this trade confusion, there are several clear missions and task teams landing in Latin America and say, well, how can we access those critical minerals? Because, by the way, I just looked at the Bloomberg story the other day, China is suspending the export of critical minerals to some countries. And of course, if the United States is doing this, European Union is also doing that. And not surprisingly, the Chinese, who are the leaders, they are also arriving in Latin America. Okay, let's check here the competitors. So clearly, there will be a lot of news and noise and things happening around this critical mineral in Latin America. So if we, not only Brazil, but the rest of Latin America, we play well with our cards, it's going to be a very, very interesting proposition.
Okay, cool. I am conscious of the fact that we are getting to a situation where we are running out of time, but I'm therefore going to move towards the end of our time together, and I'm going to ask both of you to perhaps comment on the opportunities or risks that the current global fragmentation situation that we're seeing presents for Brazil. Where do you see, please start to wrap it up by giving us some idea of where you see the opportunities that the current global situation provides to Brazil.
Let me start this. I'm going to come back to my old days when I was an investment banker. And that's something that we mentioned here quickly, but it's very important for everybody who is an investor. Brazil is the best carry trade in the world. So if you don't need to sleep unwell during the night, so the carry trade in Brazil, because of have very high real interest, is something that is unheard of in other markets. So if you want to do something else than carry traders, leaving your money fixed income thing, I think there is a number of opportunities, because with very high interest rates in Brazil, you are discounting heavily listed assets, for example, real estate. There is no crisis in real estate in Brazil. The prices have come down because we have very high interest rates. So it's a very interesting investment opportunity. Same thing applies for infrastructure listed funds as well. If you like a little bit more risk, if you're not risk averse, then you can move into stocks and private assets like private equity, for example, which are also trading at a significant discount because they are seeing the high interest rates, they see the currency volatility, the global environment deteriorated, and they tend to trade very below any fair valuation. So for those who have the stomach We think that probably almost everything that you pick in Brazil looks interesting. Some of them a little bit more than others, depending on how risk averse the investor is.
Honorato?
Well, on my side, very quickly. So I should not again. I already mentioned, but just to reinforce, agriculture is a key driver of Brazil. We already mentioned minerals, and so that's also very important. Brazil also has very large proven reserves of oil. I know it's not beautiful talking about oil these days, but maybe the world will need oil for a while. So Brazil also has this huge reserve. So on commodities, this is the country to be. On domestic market, well, again, there's 220 million consumers in Brazil, so you should have some exposure to domestic market in Brazil. That's very important. Capturing all these valuation opportunities that Luis mentioned, so real estate, infrastructure, retail. So we definitely believe there are huge opportunities there. But I would like to mention one area that is typically undervalued, and I think it's important for the country, and I think there are huge opportunities. That's about education. So when I look at what's going on with AI and the chance to close gaps, so I think of AI in various manners, but I typically think of AI within its opportunities to close big historical gaps of formation of capital, of human capital formation. So to that extent, Brazil lags a lot behind the global economy in education. And for those companies, I think interested in investing in education, the returns will be really, really high in the future with the use of AI and so on. So I think this is a great opportunity moving forward. Obviously, the main risk is always typically links to the macro story, and not to be repetitive and to extend much of the time here. The fiscal is still a risk. So we have elections in 2026. The next president, whoever it is, will need to attack the budget. The least, or will tackle the budget issue. The least willingness to attack the budget problems will make Brazil more vulnerable. If we attack, we'll be much less vulnerable. So beware of fiscal issues for the next 24 months.
Cool. We have another question from our attendees, and Diego, and it's very relevant to this particular question or this particular part that you were talking about, Honorato. Diego asks, is the fiscal framework approved in 2023 sustainable in the long term, given it is a built-in spending floor, relies on court decisions, etc., for any deviation from its fiscal targets? In your view, will this survive into a new administration, or can it be addressed within Lula's current or next term, if indeed he is the next president?
So the simple answer is no, it's not sustainable medium term, exactly because of the reasons Diego mentioned. So the internal rules of specific expenditures do not fit. They are trying to do, but they still do not fit with the overall budget rule. So they'll have to attack that. I think it's a discussion for 2027. I believe that even Lula will do that. But anyway, this is the most important thing that keeps the BRL undervalued, that keeps interest rates at the carry trade that Luis mentioned so high. So we need an overhaul of the Brazilian budget moving forward. It could be a little bit milder if we have credibility. We need to be a little bit tougher if we don't have credibility. But I assume this is the critical thing to monitor, and the current rules, they'll have to rethink them all into 2027.
Agreed. We don't think that fiscal accounts will be the major issue for the election 2026.
Yeah.
Never is. We think, for example, we particularly believe that security, crime,
True.
it's going to be like the rest of Latin America. Just seeing what's happening, for example, the election in Ecuador, was clearly the issue was there, and Milei won the election in Argentina. It was clearly the economic platform plus addressing crime. But having said that, the next president that we don't know is going to be Lula. We are not quite sure whether President Lula will have the health conditions to run, if he runs, if he's going to win or not.
Yeah.
But having said that, it's not very difficult to see what should be done. So we can sell this story as an an enhancement of the existing fiscal framework, in which basically what we're going to do is to de-index the budget in order to make it more biting, the fiscal rule, in terms of, okay, I'm not going to automatically spend more on several social programs. I'm going to pick up here. I'll have room of maneuver here to move the revenues from one program to another, and then you land in something that is more feasible in terms of producing a sustainable primary surplus that is going to be used to buy back domestic debt, and then you can put a halt on the government total or the gross indebtedness. So it's not that technically, it's not that difficult. It's a political decision. Although the next president is not going to be elected advertising this, it's going to be probably something more related on crime and security.
Okay, thank you very much. Guys, we've been talking for over an hour, and I very much appreciate you giving up your valuable time. I feel that we have not done the subject it is clearly a huge economy in the world, and trying to provide some insights into one of the world's largest economies in an hour is really not enough time. However, I also know that you don't have an unlimited amount of time that you can devote to these, and indeed, I would like to thank you very much for giving up of your time, sharing your knowledge and experience. It's been very insightful, and I'm sure that I would like to get back to it as well on a fairly regular basis. So the invitation is there if you're free to give up more of your time, and we'd be very happy to involve you in more of these meetings and conversations. So thank you. I would also like to thank very much the Chamber and Lena, who has been instrumental in organising this, and of course Vera Innes, our chairman or chairperson, who's done so much to promote bilateral business between the UK and Brazil, even though we've already identified there is more that can be done. And it is on, as you mentioned, Luis Fernando, it's up to the UK, really. One of my frustrations as well. I think there's an awful lot more that can be done there. We're doing our part. Let's hope that we can do more. But thank you very much to the Chamber, to Vera especially, for her continued support and her drive behind this particular subject. I would also like to thank our audience. Thank you very much for your time and your patience and listening to. And I'm sorry if we didn't cover every aspect of what you may like to have understood about the Brazilian economy. But what I would emphasize is to please follow the Chamber of Commerce. We have the socials, the Facebook, X, LinkedIn, as well as our own website. The transcript of this, and indeed the recording of this particular presentation, will be on our website and will be made available. So please do get involved with the Chamber of Commerce, especially for all subjects to do with bilateral trade between the UK and Brazil, and to find out more about Brazil. So on that note, thanks again, guys. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much to everyone else, and I look forward to talking to you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Luis. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.